full if we could teach the gullible to never be so comfortable with eyes to eat like comfort food. To disregard the bogus claims and pseudoscientific claims. Can you imagine just how much indeed the world would change? No more political predators playing on the populace, but ilkas and plots to shift and kill metropolis. No more villains with the title in the Bible, holding phony temper Bibles like the stuff they teach is vital. Imagine it was normal to have to prove a claim you make. And folks really feel ashamed expressing content that was fake. It's not to say we never make mistakes. It's just to say we go out of our way to show the evidence it takes.
Remain skeptical while you travel the road. The reason stay strapped with logic and fast. That's what it is, yo. Keep reality intact to help the truth grow. Question every claim, especially the ones you believe in. Remain skeptical while you travel the road. The reason.
Hi, welcome to the Win Award-winning show, Road to Reason, A Skeptic's Guide to the 21st Century. I'm David Tamayo, President of Hispanic American Freethinkers, and today I have the honor, pleasure, this wonderful feeling of being with Dr. Robert Penczak. I almost didn't recognize him with the suit on today. Robert, tell us a little bit about yourself, our audience, and what you work on.
Well, mostly I try to convince my wife that she couldn't have married that much better, and that's why I actually put on a jacket today for one of the rare times. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here with you. I'm a physician turned writer. Been a host of Road to Reason for a couple of years. I'm also trying to start a show in Richmond, Virginia that's going to be called Saved by Science, a humanist perspective on improving our world. And it's going to have a fair amount of overlap with what we do here, maybe a little bit more on the scientific edge. But anyway, I'll kind of talk about that. It's going to hopefully get rolled out over the next couple of months.
Wonderful. I'm looking forward to that. I think it's going to be really good. We can never have too many skeptic shows, too many science-based shows. As you know, we got plenty of work to be done in that area.
We do. And I should say, that's one of the things that our producer, Paul Sheehan, has really been interested in from the beginning of the show, to his credit, is trying to get people a little more comfortable in front of the camera, learn how you put together a show so that more people that are atheists or secular, separation of church and state, these people can sort of get a feel for it and then go out there and produce their own stuff. So,
and anyone that is interested in, who lives in the Washington, D.C. area and is interested in helping out the station and learning how to use the equipment, the cameras and the editing and all of that stuff, there's plenty of opportunity to learn. It's not expensive and we really need you. So please volunteer and come by, and you'll see how welcome we are when it comes to that.
Right, and we've got a bunch of people have joined us as hosts, and that's sort of easing everybody's burden so everybody can individually put a little more time into each show. One place that we could still use a lot of help is we have a very small staff that does a tremendous amount of work in the back, and so people that are looking for that kind of technology exposure, we would love to have you here.
Before we get started with the news, I wanted to do a couple of things. Wanted to mention a couple of announcements. One is that August of next year, American Atheist is going to be having a regional conference in Puerto Rico, San Juan, Puerto Rico, to say correctly, and it's going to be a lot of fun. So I encourage everyone to start saving some money now so you can come to this conference. I think it's going to be a lot of fun, very educational. Some people have told me that they're worried that maybe they don't speak Spanish or whatever. It's going to be mostly in English, or sometimes it might be bilingual. So I really encourage you to do that. The second thing I wanted to mention is that I wanted to do a shout out, special greetings to UCE. UCE is Humanistas Seculares de Puerto Rico, who is a group working very, very hard in this Commonwealth of the U.S. In fighting the encroachment of religion into the matters of the state. So they have, you'll be amazed. We're going to have to do a show just on Puerto Rico and the things that are going on there, because it affects, it affects elections, it affects how people vote, how people think. Keep in mind that everyone in Puerto Rico is a U.S. citizen, and it is a Commonwealth of the United States, and the influence in Latinos there is very big in the country. So
you were telling me before the show that they had some very specific language in their charter saying that there's absolute separation of church and state, and that it's now being violated routinely by the power structure.
And that goes to show you, it's really important to notice that the reason is that for many years, when religion was encroaching into the politics, no one did or said anything. And so now it's really very advanced, and now they're having to push it back. And yes, you're right, their constitution specifically says that there should be absolute separation of church and state. in those terms. There's nothing to interpret or anything like that.
So it's like our Treaty of Tripoli, which left absolutely no doubt that we're not a Christian nation, yet here we are a couple hundred years later, and a lot of people on the right.
A lot of people arguing that we are a Christian nation.
Exactly.
So, saludos muchachos, y, be strong and keep up the good work.
Great. All right.
So what do we have in the news?
I guess the first news item we're going to talk about is hopefully most people have heard of Richard Dawkins and Jerry Coyne, both very prominent evolutionary biologists. And so there's another professor, not so prominent till now, Professor McMullen at Georgia Southern University. This is a history professor, not a comparative religion professor, and he's decided that it would be perfectly appropriate to introduce into his history class some of his own religion. And one of the things that really got Dawkins and Coyne to try to involve themselves in this is that he's giving extra credit if the kids will do reports on his religion, and it's such a very transparent violation, where the government is not supposed to have anything to do with this, and here we are in a course, somebody, taking a captive audience. Their future can depend on their grades and where they get in, and so it's like coercing them.
And if this class is a requirement if this class is a requirement to graduate from any particular major, then absolutely it's coercive. And as I was saying before, maybe it should be called a creative history class.
Right, creative history. Yeah. Yeah, but so it's the kind of thing that all of us should address. It's very easy to stay in your own little part of life and whatever you're working on, but this becomes everybody's problem. When you let religion poke into government, poke into science teaching, poke into history teaching, and we get this revisionist history.
If you don't do anything.
Right, kids are going to grow up with an incorrect knowledge base and then make real decisions based on that. So
it's really sad to see that in the 21st century we're still looking at that. If you look at Robert Ingersoll's writings, you will see that he predicted that 100 years from now religion will be gone because science is really disproven religion in every aspect. I think he'd die again if he were to see, if he were to wake up and see again what's going on, because it seems that we have not made that much progress.
Yeah, I don't know if Ingersoll was such a rational thinker himself that he projects his own system onto others and says, you know what, all this scientific evidence is coming in, it would certainly sway me.
Yeah.
And one of our big problems in society is there's a lot of scientific illiteracy, people don't understand mathematics and statistics, so it's very easy to sway people if they don't have a critical thinking basis, a science basis, a little math. And it leads to the kind of government that we're seeing abroad and here in the U.S., unfortunately.
Lately I've seen a lot of politicians, when they're asked about, say, global warming, they don't want to admit that it is happening. They would say, well, I'm not a scientist,
exactly.
and go from there. Except that, if you ask them about anything else, then they are scientists. And now they do have an opinion on rape, or on, whether rape, can...
Whether aspirin between the knees is an effective cure
exactly.
against rape.
Oh, it's incredible. So that's why I find sometimes that we, in general, as people, tend to be mentally lazy and not pay so much attention as to what's going on. But this creep of religion into politics is something that we have to be. We look at Puerto Rico and see what's going on there. I was horrified when I was there about a month ago to seeing what they're dealing with. 54 municipalities, 54 townships that are declaring and using government resources to do fasting and prayers from 4 a.m. until 8 o'clock every morning, using vehicles, police cars and things of the sort, to go around the streets telling people to go pray. And when someone goes to the police and complains and says, hey, they're disturbing the peace, they're pushing, the police department will tell them, well, maybe you sound like you need a little prayer. Why don't you go pray? Yeah. And so it's really difficult. But
yeah, and people, again, if you're a Christian and they happen to be pushing your brand of Christianity in Puerto Rico, I guess you could be okay with it, but just remember, if it's any other religion, you're not going to like that. And this really should be everybody's problem. When religion starts trampling on constitutional rights, we all need to get a little more involved. But I'll say that the media really has a responsibility when a politician tries to skate off saying, I'm not a scientist. Instead of letting that go, you say, you're also not a moron. You're also voted into office to handle this critical thing that can affect civilization. What do you think about global warming? If you don't know, why haven't you informed yourself a little bit?
Well, and there's also the other thing. I'm a firm believer that a baker should bake, and a fisherman should fish, and a scientist should do what scientists do, and they're the experts. And they're telling us, hey, we're destroying our planet, and this is what's going on. Yes, you're not a scientist to contradict what they're saying. The problem is that we have gone from a society that respected scientists in the 60s, for instance, to a society that now thinks that any moron in the street is as equal as a scientist about any topic, including the topics where the scientist is actually the expert.
Right. Remember, with George Bush, he was very famous going with his gut, and that was taken as, wow, what a man's man he is, instead of, no, that's moronic.
A gut is as good as anything.
Right. People spend 20 years learning this very specific field. If they're not coming out of a paid think tank, where they're going to skew their stuff. If it's just a straight scientist, we should respect that a lot and think about it very carefully, not ignore it and go with a gut feeling.
Well, going with it sort of along the same lines, we see, what do you think of Bill Maher's brouhaha this week?
Yeah, no, it was very interesting. I'm glad you pointed me to that. Bill Maher is supposed to be giving the commencement speech at Berkeley, which has long been a very liberal bastion for education.
And freedom of speech.
And freedom of speech, which should go with those liberal values. And so, yeah, there's been an uproar about Islam, all the things that he tries to point out, the dangers of Islam. So he's very quickly labeled as a bigot and Islamophobe.
It started a couple of weeks ago with Ben Affleck that came in, and then everyone's saying, oh, Bill Maher is a racist.
Right, so Sam Harris was there,
yes.
and so Bill Maher and Sam Harris were both being hit
being a racist because they're against Islam. And so there's this issue where they're comparing belonging to a religion as being a race, which of course they're not the same thing. They're two very different things. And but Bill Maher, I give it to him. He brought in a lady to defend Islam or to have a voice in Islam, and she criticized that he doesn't have enough people from Islam in his show. And he went on and listed a bunch of them and said, "And by the way, aren't you here?"
Right. And Reza Aslan, who's a very big apologist for Islam, has been there multiple times, as Bill Maher pointed out. And it's sort of funny to see Rula Jabrain, I think was the analyst's name. It was funny to see her non-responses to, she's saying, you don't ever have anybody here, so well, you're here. Reza Aslan's been here multiple times specifically to contradict me. And she had no response other than to reassert that he's a bigot because he's pointing out some of the problems with Islam.
Well, Bill Maher and Sam Harris and a lot of people in the secular movement have said and have pointed out that the problem is that a lot of the people that are sort of light, that are liberal and they are Islam light or Christian light or whatever, they're the ones that are part of the problem. I mean, that was mentioned in Sam Harris's books, that if they did not approve tacitly or if they criticize more Islam or Christianity or whatever, that it would be a lot easier to determine, hey, these are the French group, is not being approved or supported by anyone else, but that's not what is happening.
Right, and Peter Boghossian also talks about this with the liberal left or the academic left, where if a lot of us espouse a lot of liberal values, and if you then go and say, well, we don't want to bash people on religion, but here are some of the ideological things spelled out in Islam, that you kill somebody if they're an apostate, and that infidels are fair game. You look at those just as a human being and say, that's pretty barbaric.
Part of the doctrine.
But if you're, like the left academia wants to stay away from it and say, well, we don't understand their culture, we don't want to judge somebody because we wouldn't want to be judged, but that's a disaster.
And let's respect this multiculturalism part of religion, saying, let's all live happy together, let's all just share, and I'll meet you halfway on this, and how do you meet someone halfway in murdering somebody?
Right, and it's also been a very specific tactic here. Like the right wing has dragged our politics way away from the center, way away from the left, because they keep just getting more radical on the right. And if you look at Democratic positions 20 years ago, they have not changed that much. If you look at the right wing, they've changed dramatically. Yeah. And so the new center, for all being fair, has moved to the right, and that's not a solution. I
would argue that the Democrats have moved to the right.
Yeah.
And if you look at Reagan, and even someone who at the time, many years ago, Robert Dole. I used to think that he was the most right-wing person ever. I think by today's standard, he would be sort of in the left of the Republican Party. It might not be easily elected depending where he would be running.
Right, and it's not, conservative is one issue, but just then the idea that you can make junk up, get caught out on it because we're such uncritical thinkers, and that doesn't destroy your political career. If you think back to the elections and when they're going after women's reproductive rights.
Yes.
and like Mitt Romney didn't quite realize that when you take away all these forms of birth control, that's going to include some of the major forms of birth control. And he didn't feel he needed to teach himself and educate himself on that specific issue that he was going to pass countrywide legislation for. Yeah. And that should be a problem. That's something that the media should be calling these people out all the time. And religion plays a huge part of it, because if you're going to get the votes, if you just spell out, we want all the money for the rich, that doesn't do so well. If you spell out, I'm a good Christian, I want Jesus back in the schools, then all of a sudden you have a whole voting block.
That vote just merely on those facts. Now, the reason we're talking about politics a little bit is because we have midterm elections coming up next week, and I hope everyone watching goes to vote. There is one party that I'm not going to mention, but we all know who it is, that doesn't like voters at the polls, and the least number of voters that show up, the better they do. So I'm encouraging everyone to go vote their conscience. So far as I understand, 15 million voters have already sent in their ballots either in the mail or have voted early. So there's already, we already
and that's despite a lot of purposeful obstruction from the right wing trying to block early voting. And,
yes. Now, some people have asked me some people have asked me about Hispanics and what effect are they going to have in these elections. They did have a big effect in the elections last time, but they are not going to have a major effect because they're not in districts that are being fought at this point. But it is a voting bloc that is increasing every year, and at these elections, more Hispanics are going to be voting than at any time in the history of the country. So that's something to watch out for if you're a politician.
Right, and more non-believers, as we see those numbers keep swelling, are going to be voting, more admitted non-believers, I guess, than ever before. And that's another thing that, something we can do in atheism and secular America is start to get a little more politically organized and realize that we have to be involved in all sorts of battles. Yes. This is something that we'll talk about with our guest Greta Christina a little bit.
And I think we need to, in a minute, we're going to break to go and finally talk to Greta Christina, our main guest today. One last thing that I want to say before we go into the break is that that is sort of bothersome. A lot of the Democrats seem to be running away from Obama. But if you actually go and look at the record, there are a lot of things that are doing good as far as the economy remember, we were in free fall when Obama took over, and at least right now we're going uphill in the right direction. For me, the best thing that Obama did, and that I think was worth my vote, I voted for him, was when he repealed the stem cell research ban that was in place, and I think he did that like the next day after he was elected. So to me, that was well worth it. I think science and investigation should not play politics, and that is something that stem cell research appears to have a lot of potential for that.
Right. On the other hand, we should point out, and I was also an Obama supporter, but I've been very disappointed that religion still gets way too much play, and we need to change the perception that politicians can't just be honest, skeptical thinkers. And some of that's perception that we can change by more people coming out. And some of it, sadly, is reality that we have to change the whole educational system. And we talked about this a little before the show. Where do parental rights come in? Where does a kid's right to learn how to be a critical thinker come in? And it needs to be sort of a broad societal discussion, how we start educating young people.
Excellent. All right, well, we'll go on a break right now, and we'll see you in a couple of minutes with Greta Christina.
This is Richard Dawkins. Doing commercials is unfamiliar territory for me, but I'm inviting you to watch Road to Reason, a skeptic's guide to the 21st century, on Fairfax Public Access every Sunday. Each week the hosts tackle wishful thinking, religion, pseudoscience, and the harm they cause, with a combination of facts, humor, and community involvement. They challenge believers to defend their faith and give you, the skeptic, a voice. With live call-ins for viewers and streaming on the World Wide Web, there's never a dull moment. Don't wait, look at them now on Facebook and YouTube, and remember to watch Road to Reason, a skeptic's guide to the 21st century, or there'll be hell to pay. This is Richard Dawkins.
Kill the idolaters wherever you find them. Shoot them if you can, stab them, throw stones at their heads, poison them, run them over, burn their fields, and if you're unable, spit in their faces. This challenge, issued to all in India who would support the Islamic State, was proclaimed in a message from a jihadi group based on the Pakistani side of the Indian border at the conclusion of the annual Hajj pilgrimage. The group, known as Ansar al-Tawhid fi Balad al-Hind, is also thought to be led by Sultan Abdul Qadir Ammar, a 39-year-old Muslim cleric who has been a fugitive from previous jihadist activities. Using a pseudonym, the message was released on video with the speaker's face digitally masked. In a statement to Reuters, the executive director of the Institute for Conflict Management in New Delhi, A.J. Sahni, said there is no doubt that the radicalization process has begun in different parts of the country. Islamic fundamentalists are seeking to indoctrinate Indian Muslims. The group is thought to be comprised of breakaway associates of the Indian Mujahideen, a Karachi-based jihadist organization wanted by Interpol for several bombings dating back as far as 2005. At 430,000 square feet, 8 stories in height, and a cost of over $800 million, the Museum of the Bible in Washington, D.C. promises to be one of the most imposing buildings in the vicinity of the National Mall. Planned for an opening date in 2017, the building will house some 40,000 artifacts related to the Christian Bible, including fragments of the Dead Sea Scrolls, cuneiform tablets, and a 14th century manuscript known as the Roseberry Roll. The project is the brainchild of Steve Green, a Southern Baptist and president of the craft store chain Hobby Lobby, which has led most skeptics and even many Bible scholars to fret that the museum's goals are more evangelical and educational. For his part, Green admits that when he first conceived the idea, he planned on building the museum in Dallas, Texas, where most residents would be preconditioned to have a positive view of the Protestant Christian version of the Bible. In fact, the mission statement of the project at that time read in part, "Bring to life the living Word of God to inspire confidence in the Bible's absolute authority." However, as Green determined to move the project in the hopes of attracting a wider audience, the mission statement has altered to promise an experience which will be dedicated to the scholarly approach to history, narrative, and the impact of the Bible. A recent synod, Greek for a walk together, convened by...
All right, welcome back. That was very interesting, actually. Thank you so much. Welcome back to Road to Reason, a skeptic's guide to the 21st century. And I think without, we're running out of time fast, and I want to spend as much time with Greta Christina as much as possible. So I'm going to read real fast, a brief introduction, not a whole thing because we'll be here forever. But Greta Christina has been writing professionally since 1989 on topics including atheism, sexuality, LGBT issues, politics, culture, and many other very interesting topics. She's the author of, as far as I can tell, 5 books. Coming Out Atheist is the latest one that we're going to be discussing today, among other things. Why are atheists so angry? 99 things that piss off the godless, and bending dirty kinky stories about pain, power, religion, unicorns, and more. I haven't read that one, but I think I will now. And she's also the editor of Paying For It, a guide by sex workers for their clients. She has been a public speaker for many years and is on the Speakers Bureau of the Secular Student Alliance, and her writings have appeared in several magazines and newspapers including Ms., Penthouse, Chicago Sun-Times, On Our Backs, and Skeptical Inquirer, and numerous other anthologies and publications. So you can follow Greta on Twitter at Greta Christina, and with that, Greta Christina, welcome to Road to Reason.
Hey, thank you so much for having me on your show.
It's, for me it's an honor to have you here. You're one of my heroes, and I hope I don't stumble as I ask you a lot of questions today. But I was thinking that perhaps before we get started, and since the title of the book is Coming Out, before we get going on anything, perhaps you can tell us a little bit about your own coming out story to make sure we get to that before we talk about a lot of other topics.
I mean, I'm happy to talk about my coming out story, although it's not as interesting as some other people's, because coming out was relatively easy for me. My family are all non-believers. I live in San Francisco, which is a relatively progressive city. And so for me, when I realized that I was an atheist and I came out as an atheist, it was not as traumatic as it is for some other people. That being said, I did have some difficulty with it. When I started, especially when I started critiquing religion and speaking out against religion, I did have some friends who had a hard time with it, and I did lose some friendships over that. But my own story is actually, one of the things that I like about the book is it's not mostly based on my own story. I interviewed over 400 atheists, or interviewed them or read coming out stories from other sources. And so the book is largely not based on my own experience. It's largely based on the experiences of these hundreds of atheists and their own stories about coming out.
Well, maybe we can have you jump to one of the stories that grabbed my interest with, with Amanda Neef from. Can you tell us her story with President Obama and how she decided to come out and why?
Well, it's a very unusual story, but it's a very interesting and funny one. So Amanda Knief was involved with the, I can't remember now which organization it was, Secular Coalition for America, I think. And she was involved in this town hall meeting with President Obama, that President Obama was leading, and he was calling on people, and he happened to call on her, and she asked him, she came out as an atheist in public in this major town hall meeting that was being televised and watched by millions of people, and said, I'm an atheist, and I want you made a promise during your election that you would put a stop to faith-based initiatives being sponsored by the federal government if they promoted religion. Why aren't you living up to that promise? And it's such a great story because she said that she had her heart in her throat. She was a little nervous about it, but it's like one of the best things she ever did because a lot of people watched it. A lot of people were really inspired by it. People were inspired themselves to come out as atheists. And she made a lot of connections and forged a lot of friendships when she did that. And that's a story that comes up a lot in the book. Overwhelmingly, when people come out as non-believers, they say they're glad they did it. Even if it's difficult with their families, even if it's difficult with their friends or with their workplace, most of the time people who have come out as non-believers say they think it was the right decision, their lives are better for it, and they're glad they did it. Sometimes they have regrets about how they did it or when they did it. They think they should have chosen their time and place better. They think they should have chosen their language better. They should have made better decisions about who to come out to first. And that's a lot of what the book talks about, is how to make your decisions about coming out, when to do it, where to do it, who to talk to first, when to start, whether you want to get into arguments about religion or leave that alone, how much you should explain your atheism, that kind of thing. So there's a lot of, collected wisdom in this book, again, from these hundreds of atheists, talking about, mostly they say they're glad they came out, but they're talking about, here's what I think I did right, here's what I think I did wrong.
Now, are there any stories that you saw that where you were asked not to publish them and just to keep them to yourself, or were there any stories that you felt were too private or too radical, or whatever reason that you decided not to include them in the book? And are there any plans to sort of keep expanding on these experiences that you've reported here?
Well, the stories that I quote in the book are stories that people specifically said they wanted to be made public. I put out a call on my blog saying, I want to hear your coming out stories, tell them to me. And then I went to other websites, other books where coming out stories were collected. So the stories are all people who wanted their stories disclosed. Now, there are some people who they're out to some people but not to others, and so they ask that I only use their first name, or that I use a pseudonym, or that I only use their online handle. And in those cases, of course, I respected their privacy. Essentially, however somebody wanted to be attributed in the book, that's how I attributed them. But these are all stories from people who wanted their stories told. And it's one of the things that when atheists get together, we like to tell our stories. We like to talk about, and especially we like to talk about our coming out stories. We like to talk about how we became non-believers in the first place, and we like to talk about how we came out, if we're out. And there's a lot of parallels actually between coming out atheist and coming out LGBT, and that's one of the parallels, is that LGBT people, same thing. You get us in a room together and we start telling our coming out stories. So no, there weren't really any stories where wanted to keep people's privacy because everybody wanted their story told. And I don't think that there were any stories where it was too intense or anything like that. I wanted the intense stories told as well as the more ordinary ones, and that's one of the things about coming out stories is they really cover a wide variety. It's like there's everything from my family's not speaking to me anymore, which is rare, but it does happen, to it was completely fine, it was not a big deal at all, to I came out and now my family are all atheists too. And that's one of the really common things about coming out atheist is you find other atheists in your life. There's a lot of stories in the book where people came out and all of a sudden they find that there's atheists in their lives that they had no idea because they were afraid to come out too. It's one of the good things about coming out is it makes it easier for other atheists to come out as well.
I would say I've had that experience very recently at a party. Not that I've been in the closet about being an atheist, but this was a group of people, we hadn't talked about it, something just came up in conversation, and we ended up speaking about evolution and some educational things, and two of the other people at that party were like, oh yeah, we're also atheists, and it was such a big relief, I think, to have a little pocket of liberalism in an era where maybe they didn't expect it. One thing that I did want to follow up on that you said that I think is really important is even when people come out and it doesn't go smoothly, most of them tend to be very happy with the end result. Robert Trivers has an interesting book, Folly of Fools, and he talks about in the LGBT community how being closeted has really bad immunological effects and health consequences. And I was wondering if you can talk about, both from LGBT and also as an atheist, what that process of being in the closet is, what mental state it puts you in all the time, and what coming out has to offer.
Sure. There's a lot of research about this on LGBT people. There's less so on atheists, although there is some, and I'll get to that in a minute. But there's a huge amount of research on LGBT people showing that being closeted is extremely stressful. And that's understandable. It's like, having to keep really important secrets from the people that you care about, and having to keep track of who knows what and how they could hurt you if they don't tell. Also, when you're closeted, if people say bigoted things about you, you can't push back. You have to just sit there and take it in. Whereas if you're open about, in this case, being LGBT, and somebody says something that's homophobic or biphobic or transphobic, you can speak up. You can say, you know what, I'm gay, I'm lesbian, I'm bisexual, I'm trans, and what you're saying isn't true. And there's a huge amount of research on this, and on LGBT people. Being closeted is very stressful and it does real damage. There's less research on that about atheists, but the research that has been done says the same thing, that being closeted causes stress. If people are less happy when they're closeted, on average, obviously there's exceptions, and that on average people are much happier, their lives are better when we come out, because you're not having that constant worry, that constant fear of what's going to happen if people find out. You're not having to constantly parse your words and think about, well, how do I say this thing that I want to say in a way that doesn't reveal too much? And you're not having to shut up and listen when people say bigoted things about you.
Greta, when you were writing this book, what did you find was the most challenging thing in creating this book? I'm sorry.
The most challenging thing in creating the book really was, I'm sorry, rephrase the question.
Well, I was going to, most authors, when they write a book, they find certain parts of the book that are difficult to write or difficult to address, or there are certain parts of the creative process where they have some difficulty. And I'm wondering if you encountered that, or was it you sat down on Friday and by Sunday it was done?
Well, it's definitely not sitting down on Friday and by Sunday it was done. Working on this book took a long time. And I would say that from a practical sense, the most challenging thing was the responsibility to get other people's stories right. This wasn't just telling my own story. This wasn't just talking about my own opinion. I really had to be true to other people. And so that process of just reading through these hundreds of stories and wanting to do justice to their story and make sure I was telling their story accurately, that was probably the biggest just practical challenge. The biggest emotional challenge was that were some stories in this book that were very painful. Mostly not, and I was actually surprised. I thought it was going to be just reading these stories was going to be a parade of tragedies. And there wasn't as much tragedy as I had feared there would be, but there was. It's like reading the stories of, for instance, the people in Jehovah's Witness families who came out and their families won't speak to them or even look at them again. Those stories were very painful to read. And so I would say that was the biggest emotional challenge, was just really, really getting into the nitty-gritty of atheists' lives, which again, there's a huge variety, but some of the stories were very upsetting. And again, even though people say, I think this was the right decision, some of the stories were very painful.
Staying with that theme of kind of difficult or sad things, do you have any comments that you can give us on the story with Kaylee Wilson, the teenager that tried to came out in North Carolina, tried to start a secular group, all the difficulty that she ran into sort of despite her courage?
That's a story that comes up again and again. For students especially, it's difficult to come out when you're dependent on your parents, whether you're a high school student or a college student whose parents are supporting you in any way. It is one of the most difficult things, is that, you do have this dependency, and so people can make your life really, really difficult. And of course, in school, especially if you're talking about high school, although it still happens in college or university as well, there is often this environment of bullying, and of, especially bullying anybody who's different, bullying anybody who pushes back against the status quo. And it's very common in high schools especially. College and university students have an easier time of it, but it's very common for high school students to have their school administration push back and try to deny them their right, which if they're in a public school, they have the legal right to form a student group. But administrators will often throw up roadblocks. Teachers will often not be supportive. Other students will often bully or harass them. So these stories are, unfortunately, they're not uncommon. But again, it often surprisingly happens better than people think it will. Often, it's like, I certainly read a lot of those horror stories, but I also read stories of people saying, I started a student group in my school, and now I have this whole new group of friends that I would have never known before. And the teachers had a hard time with it at first, but now they're fine with it, now that they see we're not, gonna, completely destroy the morality of the school or whatever. So again, experience is coming out. One of the things that really struck me about it, researching it, is just how varied they are.
So now your book came out in April, and you already have it in audio and electronic format and paper format in all kinds of ways, accessible to everyone. Have you received any feedback? What kind of feedback have you had so far, negative versus positive, or what mixture of feedback have you personally received?
The feedback has been mostly positive, almost entirely positive. A lot of people respond to the stories, because I quote a lot of the atheists who coming out stories in their own words, and a lot of people respond to that really positively. And the book is written in this very just kind of down to earth, straightforward style, and a lot of people respond to that. They're like, yeah, it's like, I found it really accessible, I found it really readable. The only real negative criticism is one that I think is kind of interesting, which is some people say that they found the book repetitive, that there's some themes that come up over and over again. And I understand that critique, but there's a specific reason I did that. So the book is broken down by chapter into here's how you come out to your family, here's how you come out at the workplace, how you come out to friends, here's how you come out if you're in the military, if you're in the clergy, if you're a student, if you're a parent, if you're in a conservative region, whatever. My assumption in writing this book was that a lot of people would skip the chapters that didn't have anything to do with them, and they would go straight to the chapters that were about them. That if they're in the military, they're going to go to the military chapter. If they're a parent, they're going to go to the chapter on coming out if you're a parent. And so there were certain themes that were important to me that I did repeat throughout the book to make sure that everybody reading the book, even if they skipped a bunch of the earlier chapters, that they would still get it. But yeah, overwhelmingly the response has been very positive. The reviews have been very positive on Amazon and other bloggers and so on. So it's actually been very gratifying.
Something else I want to follow up on is Herman Mehta's Young Atheist Survival Guide, Helping Secular Students Thrive. You mentioned that a few times in there. Another thing that you do at the end of your book is you give a very extensive set of resources. Maybe touching on that book and some of the resources, what can people like Kaylee do, or in college, if you do run into an administration that's flouting the law and not working with you, who do you turn to for help?
Well, the first thing I would say is if you're running into real practical problems with trying to organize a student group, talk to the Secular Student Alliance and talk to the Freedom of Religion Foundation. They're actually working together on a project to, basically the Freedom from Religion Foundation, their area of expertise is legal issues and pushing back on legal obstructions to, secularism and church-state separation. The Secular Student Alliance, their job is to help students organize student groups. And so they are teaming up to support students who are running into problems. So yeah, basically there are entire organizations that are out there to support you. And it was one of the things when I was pulling the resource guide together. You're right, the resource guide is kind of huge. And I was really gratified by that. It made me really happy. When I was putting that, I've made it a challenge. It's like trying to compile a resource guide of atheist resources that's anything remotely comprehensive. It's huge, and that's something that we've really improved on. In the 10 years ago, that was much less true. And the resources that are available to atheists who need therapy, atheists who are grieving, atheists who are recovering from alcohol or drug addiction, atheists who are just leaving religion and are struggling with that, ex-Muslims, ex-Buddhists, ex-Jews, atheists from different geographical regions. There's a huge amount of resources available. So one of the main things I would say to atheists who are considering coming out but are afraid that they're going to lose support, which is a legitimate fear. A lot of social and practical support comes from religion, but there is the atheist community and the atheist movement is really growing by leaps and bounds, and there's a lot of support available.
Yeah, so Dr. Andy Thompson, who's with the Dawkins Foundation, is a psychiatrist, does a lot of neuroscience, made a similar point probably a year ago where he brought a stack of books just to show that there's a lot of new atheist or very science literature that's going to be of interest to us. And I really loved your resource guide because it does, I kind of go through the books, look for stuff that I might want to read, and I did find that very helpful.
I had a question, shifting a little bit here. I've seen some gay people that have criticized atheists for stealing their terms, for stealing their techniques. They say we put a lot of sweat and blood and tears into getting these techniques, and the sayings and the things, coming out of the closet. That's ours. You're stealing it from us, and we don't want to be associated with atheists, and so forth. Have you heard this before? And what is your perception of this? What are your comments on this?
Well, the first thing I want to say is I myself am bisexual, and I've been involved in the LGBT community and movement for many decades now. I have heard this critique some, although the thing that's important to note is that most LGBT atheists don't say that. Overwhelmingly LGBT atheists say, yeah, there are a lot of parallels between the atheist movement and the LGBT movement, and we do have a lot to learn from each other. And and coming out as atheist is similar in many ways to coming out as LGBT. There's some important differences as well. The thing I would say to people who say you shouldn't be using the language is the phrase coming out has now, it's just entered the lexicon. People have been using that phrase to mean disclosing something about yourself that you think people will have a hard time with for decades now. It doesn't just mean coming out LGBT anymore. People talk about coming out as polyamorous. People talk about coming out as kinky. People talk about coming out with unpopular political beliefs. Coming out as a Chicago Cubs fan or whatever. So when if LGBT people have a problem using the language, it's a little. If they have a problem with atheists using that language, it seems pretty clear to me that the problem isn't with the language being used at all. The problem is with atheists. And that's just bigotry, and LGBT people should not be being bigoted against atheists. We should know better.
One great point that you made in your book that I hadn't thought about before was you talked about the LGBT community and how for those people that have found a progressive religious community, it's incredibly difficult for them to want to separate themselves from that because they've been so ostracized for a lot of their life. They finally found a community, and now you're asking them, based on this intellectual belief or non-belief in God, walk away from that. So maybe, can you talk about that a little? Why we should have a little more empathy sometimes for people that are not ready to declare themselves atheists?
I mean, I think that it is true. If you've been brought up your whole life being told that you are disgusting and shameful for being LGBT and that God hates you, or that he, there's that whole hate the sin, love the sinner, but I'm sorry, we know that's junk. It's being LGBT is something that you are to the core of your being. You can't separate it out that way. So when you're told your whole life, God hates your sexuality, God hates your body, God thinks that what you're doing with your body is disgusting, and then you find a religious community that tells you, no, God loves you. God thinks it's amazing that you're gay. God wants you to be gay, to be lesbian, to be bi, to be trans. I think a lot of LGBT people find that very comforting and very, very soothing. And it's, then here atheists come along, saying, well, no, God doesn't hate you because God doesn't exist. That is, I think, that's not as soothing in the same way. What I would say is that it has the comfort of being true. And this is something I know from my own experience when I was a spiritual believer, is I definitely found my spiritual beliefs comforting to the degree that I didn't think about them. And, I could only think about them a little bit, because once I started thinking about them in depth, I was like, oh, this doesn't really make any sense, and I don't think there's a good reason for me to believe this, and I think I'm just making this up as I go along based on what I want to have be true. That's ultimately not very comforting. And I know from, times in my life, for instance, a good example is dealing with death and grief. Times in my life when I was dealing with death and grief as a believer, there was a sense in which my belief was comforting, but there was always this sense of unease about it, because I couldn't really think about my beliefs. As a non-believer, when I've, had to deal with death and grief, it's been difficult because I have to accept I'm really never going to see this person again. But my humanist and my skeptical philosophies about grief, about death and grief, they're more comforting because they're real, and I don't have to lie to myself. I don't have to pretend. Now, if somebody is in a situation where they're really using religion to deal with immediate crisis, they're using religion to deal with somebody who's died a little while ago, they're using religion to deal with say, recovering from alcohol or drug addiction, I'm not going to try to talk them out of it. And obviously, if somebody just doesn't want to have that conversation with me, I'm not going to force it on them. But, in terms of the public conversation about religion, I don't think we should be promoting falsehood just because people find it comforting. I think that ultimately truth is more comforting than, knowing that what we believe is really true is more comforting than lying to ourselves.
Greta, in preparation for this interview, I asked some young students what question they wanted to know about you as an author, as a blogger, and so forth. And so I'm going to ask you two questions in one. The first one is, who are the authors that you read? What kind of books do you like to read? What kind of books interest you? Number one. And number two, how did you do in English class when you were in high school? Were you like the A student and all the brightest student in English, or were you average, or what?
Okay, well, so I'll answer the second question first because it's easier. Yes, I did do very well in school, especially in English class. And in fact, having a natural talent as a writer, I shouldn't say this to students, but I'm going to say it anyway. Having a natural talent as a writer meant that I could get by in school with doing less work. Because it's like, hey, if you're a good writer, you can,
You're a natural.
Right, you can write your paper at the last minute in a way that somebody who's not a good writer can't. So, but I'm not really telling you to write your paper at the last minute. That's a bad idea. But yes, I did do well. I was a pretty good student anyway. I liked school. I was one of those weird kids who actually liked school. I didn't like the social aspect of it. It was conformist and bullying. But I liked studying and I liked learning things. And so I did do well in English class. What kind of books I like? That's all over the map. I mean, I tend to like a lot of books about science. I like especially books about neuroscience and how the mind works. I like books about politics and history. The history of social change, especially, is really interesting to me. For a while, I was only reading nonfiction, and I'm getting back into fiction. I just recently read Great Expectations, which I'd never read for the first time. I just read Huckleberry Finn, which I'd never read I read that for the first time. So yeah, Yeah, my taste in reading is kind of all over the map, actually. And I think that that's something that makes me a better writer. I think that it's good for writers to read a wide variety of kinds of things.
Now, you've been a social activist for a long time, and I said we mostly wanted to focus on your book for the show. I did want to spend a few minutes talking about a couple of problems. One is just the divisiveness that we sometimes see within the atheist community. What your feelings are in terms of, should atheists necessarily be linked to humanism and promoting gay rights, more racial equality, sort of just humanist issues? And then a second thing is, there is some real misogyny where we'll see some people in the atheist community are just nasty toward women, and it's nothing that I would try to justify, it's nothing I would ever apologize for them. Then there's other people that sometimes try to make a very nuanced argument and still get a lot of flack for it. If they're talking about evolutionary psychology, and men and women have had different evolutionary pressures, and so they are different in some ways. Sometimes there really can be a nuanced argument to make without trying to be nasty about it. So if you can address those two, how humanist should atheists be, and then also how do we separate out people that really are misogynist versus some that it's a political correctness they have to be careful of?
Okay, well, I'm going to take the second question first. First of all, you need to be really careful with the phrase political correctness. Political correctness tends to be a buzzword for anybody who speaks out about social justice. And whenever I hear somebody say, "Oh, you're just being politically correct," honestly, what I hear is, "Shut up! Stop talking about social justice. Stop talking about women's rights. Stop talking about racism. Stop talking about poverty." In terms of essentially what it sounds like you're saying, and I have a really hard time with this, is that if somebody isn't being really overtly, grotesquely racist or sexist or misogynist, they're not using slurs, they're not using, their threats, and so on, that therefore we should cut them slack, that therefore we shouldn't criticize them firmly if their ideas are really bad. And there's a lot of really bad ideas being spread around in atheism about gender, about race, about class. Evolutionary psychology is a good example. There's a lot of really bad evolutionary psychology out there. And there's a lot of just terrible ideas about, oh, this is what men are really like inherently, this is what men are born like, this is what women are born like, we have these radically different evolutionary pressures. That gets used as an excuse to discriminate against women. It has been used as an excuse to discriminate against women for centuries. And a lot of the science behind it is really, really bad. And I think that it's worth critiquing the science, and I think it's worth critiquing it robustly. And this idea that we should be able to have a calm, reasoned, entirely rational, unemotional discussion when our basic rights as human beings is what's being discussed. With this idea, there was a controversy a little while ago in atheism about abortion, and there was sort of this idea that, oh, well, we should be able to have a calm, reasoned, discussion about abortion without emotions getting in the way. Well, you know what? I'm going to get emotional about the issue of abortion because it's a question of my bodily autonomy. It's a question of, should I be forced to donate my organs without my consent? That's an emotional issue, and often telling women, telling African Americans, telling trans people, telling poor people, you need to not be so emotional about the oppression against you, it's a silencing tactic. It's we need to be willing and able to listen to people who are angry. I mean, it's kind of, there's this irony, which is I wrote this book, Why Are You Atheists So Angry? 99 Things That Piss Off the Godless. And atheists love it. It's like, yeah, we should be angry. We should be angry at all the discrimination against us. And then when we start speaking about why feminists are angry, why African Americans are angry, why LGBT people are angry, why poor people are angry, then they say, oh no, you need to be calm and not so emotional. So there's a real hypocrisy there. As to the first question about atheism getting involved in other social justice issues, it depends a little bit on what you mean by organized atheism. If you're talking about, say, a national organization that has a specific mission, American Atheist or Freedom from Religion Foundation, I don't expect those organizations to get involved in issues that are totally off mission. What I do expect them to do is to pay attention to issues that are within their mission, but that are of greater concern to marginalized people, that are of greater concern to women, or of greater concern to people of color, greater concern to poor people, and so on. Because if we don't do that, those marginalized people aren't going to be interested in our movement, because they're not going to have, why would they care? We don't care about their issues. Why should they care about ours? And then when you're talking about on a community level, when you talk about, say, local atheist communities, local atheist communities do things that are quote-unquote off-mission all the time. Local atheist communities do highway cleanups, they do blood drives, they do picnics, they do pub nights. None of that has anything to do with atheism, but it's how we build community. Religion provides community and social support for a lot of people. We provide communities that replace that. We need to be willing to have those communities be welcoming and supportive of a wider variety of people. We need to recognize that African Americans often have different needs and need different kinds of support than white people. We need to recognize that women often need different kinds of support than men. We need to recognize that trans people often need different kinds of support from cisgender people. And if we're not willing to look at how we are making our communities unwelcoming to a wider variety of people, then we're not going to be welcoming to a wider variety of people. We're humanists and we're skeptics. We should be willing to look at what we're doing wrong,
Greta,
and re-examine that.
Greta, we have about 30 seconds left or so, maybe 45 seconds. But I wanted to take advantage and ask you a quick question and see if I can get an easy answer. Yesterday, I got an email from a secular leader saying, you either unfriend this person or unfriend me, but I don't want you to be friends with that other person. How should I respond to that? Dear
Well,
Abby.
I think you should look at what the person has done and decide whether you think that what they've done is okay. There are people in this movement who say and do really horrible things, and I think that it's worth looking at. The person who asked you, I want you to unfriend that person, look at what they did, look at why they are asking you that, and then make your own decision about, do I really want to be friends with this person?
Excellent. Thank you so much. I really want to, we've run out of time, but I really want to thank you for being so gracious. And we have 200 other questions to ask, but time always runs out. Thank you so much for coming and being here with us today.
I guess
you're so welcome. Thanks.
Yeah, I was going to throw in one thing. With evolutionary psychology, I'd agree that that's a very new science, and one of the big criticisms is that some of it's just so stories where it doesn't have all the evidential backup, but it does also explain some things, and maybe we can continue this further. I don't know if we'll ever agree, but thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Greta.
Talk to you later.
Thanks.